Okay, well, welcome everyone. Hello and welcome to the IAVS Vegetation Classification Seminar Series hosted by the Vegetation Classification Working Group Steering Committee. My name is Aaron Wells. I'm a vegetation ecologist from Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm secretary of the VCWG Steering Committee. This seminar series is an online lecture series featuring invited speakers who present their diverse perspectives on related topics to vegetation classification. Today we'll have Wolfgang Willner and Don Faber-Langendoen presenting a proposal to catalog and describe terrestrial ecosystems around the globe using the Braun-Blanquet and EcoVeg international vegetation classification approaches. Wolfgang is a vegetation scientist interested in vegetation classification and the current and historical biogeographical factors shaping the species composition of plant communities, with a special focus on Eurasian steppe and temperate forests. He is managing director of the private research institute, Vienna Institute for Nature Conservation and Analysis. Don is senior ecologist and conservation methods coordinator for NatureServe and fosters standard methods for classifying and mapping the diversity of ecosystems across the globe through his work on the International Vegetation Classification. He is also regional editor of the Ecological Society of America's USNVC Peer Review Board and co-chairs the Canadian National Vegetation Classification Committee. So we'll hold questions to the end, but feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A throughout the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Wolfgang.
Okay, thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me. And so I will share my screen. So now you should see my presentation. Okay, so in this first part, I want to give a short historical review about the upper levels of the Braun-Blanquet approach and whether they exist or not. So how do I get to the next slide? Here they are. Here's a comparison of the hierarchies of the EcoVeg and the Braun-Blanquet approach, and you can see that the lower and mid levels are basically the same, although some ranks have different names. But it seems that the upper levels, biome and formation, are missing in the Braun-Blanquet approach. However, if this is really the case, this has been a controversial issue for almost a century. So the question is, can we incorporate the floristic units of the Braun-Blanquet system in the global formation system? And there are different opinions about this. Some prominent phytosociologists said yes, and here you can 3 of them. However, the master himself, Lucius Braun-Blanquet, said no. And to prove his point, he described the class Vaccinophycetea, which included both coniferous forests and dwarf shrub heaths, which obviously belong to 2 different formations. Many of you will know that the class in this broad circumscription is no longer accepted. So now we distinguish these 2 types as different classes. But nevertheless, the question is still open. And for a long time, it was not really clear for me why Braun-Blanquet was so against the formation concept, and I had to dig into his works, like his PhD thesis from 1915, and of course his textbooks. Here you can see the English translation of the first edition. There are 3 German editions. I'm not sure if the second and the third edition have ever been translated into English. And it turned out that Braun-Blanquet struggled with the question, what is the highest level of the hierarchy throughout his life without coming to a definite solution. And he made several proposals, which I will briefly introduce. But let's start with the formation definition that was adopted at the International Botanical Congress in Brussels in 1910. Here you can see the original French definition, and here is a translation by myself. So a formation consists of associations which are different in the floristic composition, but which grow under similar site conditions and exhibit analog growth forms. So site conditions and growth forms are the important things here. And Braun-Blanquet strongly criticized this concept. This is an excerpt of the first edition of his textbook, where he calls this an archaic classification. And citing Pavillard, he says, would we place white sheep and white rabbits in one genus just because they are white? So for him, the arrangement of associations according to their appearance is an expression of laziness and without philosophic grounds. But as I said, he was still concerned with the grouping of these floristic units into global ones. And in his important methodological paper from 1921, he introduced the sociological progression, which is a grouping of plant communities according to their organizational complexity based on structure and function. He didn't use this word, but that's how he would put it today. Here the main groups proposed by Braun-Blanquet, starting with a simple communities like plankton, desert communities, and going all the way up to forests. Almost at the same time, he proposed another unit above the highest floristic unit, which is the glass, and he called it the circle of vegetation. This name was introduced in 1925. The circle of vegetation is basically a broad floristic biogeographic unit, which is closely related to the concept of zonality. And here in this graph, you can see the examples that Braun-Blanquet gave for Europe. So there's the Mediterranean circle of vegetation with Mediterranean type vegetation, and the Euro-Siberian, which includes temperate and boreal vegetation, and the Irano-Duranian circle of vegetation would include the steppes of Western Asia. This concept is fine for zonal vegetation, but the problem is that azonal vegetation does not fit into the system, and this more or less half of the classes. There are some hints in Braun-Blanquet's papers that he considered the possibility of establishing azonal circles of vegetation, but this has never been really further developed. But for some time, he really considered the circle of vegetation at the official highest level of the hierarchy, as you can see again in the first edition of his textbook. The higher units, circles of vegetation, classes, orders, alliances. And he suggested that the plant communities of a circle vegetation could be arranged according to the sociological progression. So he somehow tried to combine these two ideas, although it's not completely clear this could work. And in the textbook, there is also a very elaborate overview of this sociological progression. Here you can see just a part of it. So here are the groups. It's really a hierarchy, and the definitions are quite detailed. And he also gives for each group examples from the floristic system, alliances like amophilion, and in the most cases, it's orders. Now, the first edition of the textbook was published in 1928 in German, and at this time, no classes have been described yet. So it's clear that the orders are here the highest units. But as I've shown with the example of the Vaccinobiceta, the classes then were not congruent anymore with these groups of the sociological progression. The circle of vegetation was also used in the prodrome of plant communities that started in the 1930s. Here you can see the first volume, and it says circle of Mediterranean vegetation. But already in the second volume, which deals with rock communities, you can see a problem arising. This new class of rock communities belongs to two circles of vegetation, the Mediterranean and the Euro-Siberian one. So how can this work that a class belongs to two circles at once? There's obviously a problem, and it was never solved. In fact, the circle of vegetation was abandoned in the mid-20th century. And in the third edition of his textbook, which was published in 1964, Braun-Blanquet says this explicitly. He says the circle of vegetation is independent of the phytosociological hierarchy. It's a kind of landscape, biogeographical classification, and is not part of the phytosociological hierarchy. At the same time, he kept the sociological progression in all three editions of his textbook. He gives examples for each group, classes in the third edition, but the class Vaccinobiceta is not mentioned. But he mentions a new rank above the class, which he calls Gesellschaftsreich in German, so you can translate it as realm or class group. And this class group was introduced in 1959. So you can say this was Braun-Blanquet's final thought about the highest rank of the phytosociological system. And this class group is a group of ecologically analogous classes on different continents, which are not characterized by species, but by closely related Icarian species of the same genera. And the most famous example is the class group Quercophageia, which includes classes in North America, Europe, and East Asia of temperate deciduous forests. And there were several proposals of such class groups, but again, it was not much followed and used in the literature and is now almost forgotten. The EuroVeg checklist, published in 2016, groups the classes of Europe in informal groups, which mainly follow the principle of zonality, so that the main higher dichotomy is between zonal vegetation and azonal vegetation, and the zonal groups are very similar to the idea of circles of vegetation, and then there are a couple of azonal groups. Don and I proposed an alternative grouping of the European classes based on the formation system of the EcoVeg approach, which we thought is more appropriate and useful. In the meantime, the EcoVeg upper units have been revised. Don will tell more about it in his presentation. The new concept was published last year, so it is a revision of the three upper levels. The formation was also renamed into Ecobiome. I still prefer the term formation, but it's basically the same. There's a strong emphasis on functional traits and ecological drivers, and most formation now have a one-to-one correspondence to the IUCN ecosystem functional groups. These ecosystem functional groups really have a functional background. Here's this graph from the Nature publication. It looks quite complicated, but you can simplify it in this way. You have side factors, and these side factors are filters to the species pool, and it results in certain ecosystem properties, the physiognomy, the functional traits of the species, and also the species composition. So I would argue that these ecosystem functional groups have the philosophic grounds that Braun-Blanquet missed in the old formation concept, and it is quite similar to his sociological progression, but much more detailed and sophisticated. There are a few new formations that were missing in the old system. Here, just a few examples. We now have a new formation for Mediterranean type vegetation. It's called temperate Pyrex sclerophyll forest and woodlands. This is an important addition, and there's also a new formation for temperate coniferous forests. There are also some challenges that remain. And here two examples. One formation or ecobiome is called polar, tundra, and desert. The name suggests that it only occurs in the Arctic. But there are classes in the Braun-Blanquet system which have an Arctic alpine distribution, which means they occur both in Northern Europe, the boreal or Arctic zone, and the temperate mountains like the Alps. And these are well-defined classes. Here, to illustrate this, I show you here the distribution range of Loiseloia bocumbens, which occurs both in the Arctic, circumpolar, but also in the Alps and other high mountains of temperate Europe. So the class Loiseloia vaccinata occurs both in the Arctic and in the high mountains. And so this ecobiome should equally be present in the temperate high mountains, I think. And the same is true for boreal forests. The class Vaccinio-Picetia, although it now only includes forests, it's still present both in the boreal zone and in the montane and subalpine zone of the high temperate mountains. But as you will see in Don's presentation, the inclusion of subalpine coniferous forests of temperate mountains is handled differently in Europe and North America. So this is a point that probably needs further discussions. There might be also good reasons to do it differently, but it's not completely clear at the moment. So to conclude, the new ecobiome approach combines features of Braun-Blanquet circle of vegetation and the sociological progression, and it provides the philosophical grounds that Braun-Blanquet missed in the old formation concept. So in my opinion, there's no reason to believe that the Braun-Blanquet system is incompatible with the EcoVeg ecobiome concept. And I would rather argue that both approaches can profit from a closer integration. That's all from my side, and I guess you have the possibility to ask questions afterwards, but now we will go on with Don's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Wolfgang, and thanks again to Aaron and the working group for the invitation to give this presentation, or these two sets of presentations. So just to continue on Wolfgang's theme and sort of bring things into maybe a clearer focus as a proposal, I just want to emphasize again two of the key points from Wolfgang's presentation on why it's time to embed the Braun-Blanquet system within a global ecosystem structure. As Wolfgang has said elsewhere, it provides the opportunity to really preserve and expand the enormous wealth of knowledge in plant sociology and to make it accessible to an even larger group of users. And embedding it in this larger structure, I think also, as we've shown in Europe, enables congruence between the Braun-Blanquet approach and the EcoVeg approach, and maybe it's easy to do, and regardless, both schools would benefit from such an approach. Why focus on these two approaches? In part is because they bridge a substantial gap in vegetation classification activities. That is, vegetation ecologists have often been active at either global or local national scales. And so certainly in the last 20 plus years, biome classifications have been addressing large ecosystem patterns in new ways, but they're often generating comprehensive units that are not linked to the details of vegetation types within continents and countries. So the connectivity is lacking. At the same time, local and national classifications, which are often a primary focus of national surveys, rarely link to broad-scale global types, and so you can't see the flow of types at the different scales very easily. So we think it's time we try to fill the vegetation classification scaling gap. That is, we want global biome types to be grounded in the regional continental details. We also would like to see ways for local types to have a pathway through the regional classifications in order to link to global patterns. And we think both Braun-Blanquet and the EcoVeg approach are ready to help do that. When we look across the panorama of vegetation classifications, there is really a paucity of classifications that are willing to do the global work at these mid-scales. Braun-Blanquet and the IVC EcoVeg approach do so. Both have a track track record. Braun-Blanquet has worked largely local to continental, and the IVC has worked sort of local to global and back again. It's worth noting that the global ecosystem typology can also help, and in fact, it's probably helped us to spur to fill this gap. In terms of how similar EcoVeg and Braun-Blanquet are, I don't want to ignore the differences. A few weeks ago, I took a table that Wolfgang helped develop on the attributes of the Braun-Blanquet system, and I wrote down and compared it to the EcoVeg attributes. And when I shared this with Wolfgang, thinking, well, maybe there's a lot of differences here, his response was, or his conclusion was really that the differences between the two approaches are minor and rather reflect regional traditions than fundamental methodological disagreements. So, game on. Let's see if we can work things together. So just to compare hierarchies, Wolfgang showed an earlier comparison of the EcoVeg and Braun-Blanquet. I wanted to add in the global typology. Again, as Wolfgang noted, the Braun-Blanquet on the one hand lacks the upper levels, systematically at least. The EcoVeg approach does try to scale all the way from biome down to association. The global typology is somewhat the inverse of Braun-Blanquet. It has the global and the mid scales, but it's not that focused on the lower units. Just a comment about the global typology. It certainly was novel in part because it addressed all ecosystems, whether they're terrestrial, marine, freshwater, or subterranean. So it attempted to provide a coherent framework across the entire biosphere. It also covers zonal and azonal ecosystems, or what I would say is it characterizes ecosystems across all ecological gradients. And it also covers natural and anthropogenic ecosystems, as well as rural or novel ecosystems. So that comprehensiveness sort of opens the door broadly on ecosystem types, which I think is a good thing if we're going to characterize the current status of ecosystems. Just one comment, though, about the way the global typology is set up, which is that between level 3 and 5, there is a bit of a disconnect. That is, in order to make it functional in the near term, ecosystem functional groups step down to what they call level 4, regional ecosystem subgroups. But those are regional, eco-regional units that subdivide, if you will, the biomes at level 3. Conversely, the level 5 units, what are called global ecosystem types, bypass level 4 and simply connect directly to level 3. Level 5 units can depend on lower units, the subglobal types, or not. And so the real focus of the mid-level units in the global typology is at level 5. Whereas with the EcoVeg approach, the units are designed to work together and nested and aggregated cleanly. And so that's a difference in how those are handled. But to go to the main point, if we look across these hierarchies, what is shared at the mid-levels across all of them is this level 5, as I'll call it, the macro group on the one hand, the class on the other, and the global type of the typology. So we can look at, well, how similar are actually the definitions. The macro groups called a moderate set of diagnostic plant species and diagnostic growth forms that reflect biogeographic differences in composition and the subcontinental to regional ecological drivers. The class level doesn't have a formal definition in Braun-Blanquet. I've pulled one that was developed by Bignati et al., which is that the syntaxon defines a common ecological space of the associations and is recognized by the occurrence of a common set of characteristic taxa, which are preferentially homogeneous in terms of their biogeography or chorology. So there's 3 conditions: the taxa, the ecology, and the chorology, and implicitly the growth form or structure. and it should have a wide distributional range. Global ecosystem type is defined as a complex of organisms and their associated physical environment within an area occupied by ecosystem function group, or lower level biome. And these types are grouped based on their shared ecological processes that exhibit substantial differences in biotic composition, and they're derived from the bottom up or directly from ground observations. So you can see, despite the differences, they are all trying to address this interlinkage of composition and the functional characteristics and growth forms, and looking at the ecological drivers that affect ecosystems at those scales. We can even look to Regina's examples down at the regional biome level for another way of thinking about this level of ecosystem classification. So there's a lot that's shared in the concepts. So how would we structure the classes or macro groups or global types? Wolfgang talked about how Braun-Blanquet struggled to find a higher level organizer. I want us to reverse this and ask, given the need for these higher levels, can they help us inform the development of classes? So biomes, we know, have distinct continental expressions based on the differences in biogeographic species pools and sometimes even the growth forms. And those help form the basis for defining divisions and classes, what Wolfgang and others refer to as vicariant types. And so when we look at the definition of the different levels within the EcoVeg approach, at the division level, what stands out, of course, is this broad set of diagnostic plant species that reflect these biogeographic differences in composition and ecological drivers. So when you look at the class group proposal, which is sort of like a division, it's again a group of ecologically analogous classes on different continents that share a certain amount of similarity in species pool. That is, they share some ecological traits, functional traits, if you will. These are all relatively mesic, forest-dominated systems. And so that becomes the basis for expecting to find these comparable classes across the continents. And there are many other examples. Here's the cool temperate rainforest, clearly found on different continents. And in this case, even the growth forms are quite distinct. The giant conifers of the West Coast in North America, the Nothofagus evergreen beech and the eucalyptus of Australia and that part of the world. So in that case, we have both growth forms and composition fundamentally separating out units within the rainforest. I want to go to a biome that Wolfgang talked about, this temperate continental conifer forest, which has a major expression. In fact, really, it's the largest biome expression around the globe of this biome. And just to show again how having that ecobiome division structure helps develop proposals for comparable macrogroups, classes, or global types. So this is the ecobiome, and Bob Peet didn't know it, but back when he published his chapter on forests and meadows of the Rocky Mountains, he found a very strong biogeographic turnover in species from the Mediterranean Rocky Mountains, which are really a warm temperate biome all the way up into the boreal Rocky Mountains. And so it's that temperate core in the central and southern Rocky Mountains that have their own suite of diagnostic species. And that sort of biogeographic framework has still informed the work we're doing today. Jack Tripke and others have developed the Rocky Mountain forest macrogroups and groups. And so when we look at the current set of macrogroups, class equivalents perhaps, we see there's three major macrogroups that dominate that temperate continental conifer forest in the Rocky Mountains. that's all within this one division. There are other related units. The pinyon juniper woodlands are in a separate division, still within this continental conifer forest ecobiome. And at the other extreme, there's the subalpine high montane forests and woodlands. And so together, these macrogroups, along with a Californian Sierran set of classes, inform that that ecobiome. Now we can debate whether these are all well placed within the same biome. Wolfgang noted that the subalpine high montane, at least in part, might actually be affiliated with the boreal, depending on your perspective. Similarly, the pinyon juniper could be thought of as a separate arid temperate woodland type, at a biome level. But regardless, the lower units we're referring to here, these macrogroups, would occur, and it's just a matter of how we place them. So the biogeography both helps inform the development of these units without necessarily being forced to differ because of their biome location. That is, they're independent levels to a certain degree because of their placement lower down in the hierarchy. So we can develop a full suite of the macrogroups across the temperate conifer forest. That is the major upland expression. We should not ignore, if you will, the azonal types. So they are also developed within that same region. As Wolfgang noted, the biogeography of these units will not really follow the same patterns as the biogeography of the upland units. So we don't want to force a biogeographic pattern across all biomes, particularly when those biomes are both zonal and azonal, to use that term. So that's one way of just putting out the idea of developing mid-level units. Obviously, there's a lot of lower level information that could be brought into the definition of these mid-level units, and they become important ways to anchor the concepts, to flesh them out in full detail. But we can also look at it from the perspective of the biome downward. So it'll take many partners in this kind of a collaboration. No one tradition is going to do it alone, if only because we need many experts sharing expertise to make this happen. In the Americas, certainly in North America, we've had strong partners. The Canadian National Vegetation Classification has a technical committee membership that covers different provinces and territories. Experts in those jurisdictions are helping develop the units. In the US, we have a strong representation from the Ecological Society, from NatureServe, federal agencies, many state partners. Hundreds of us have been at work to develop the units in North America, even as we pay attention to the literature from other traditions. We've been able to work across Latin America as well. And so in our publications, we've drawn from expertise across the hemispheres. And I just want to note that, again, at the macrogroup level, we've developed those for North America and Latin America. And together, there's about 375 macrogroups. If we do the math based on the proportion of the continents that the Americas covers, maybe you multiply that by the area and you get something like maybe 1,200 macrogroups, classes. I don't know if Braun-Blanquet has ever, the tradition has ever considered how many classes there might be in the globe, but this might be at least a ballpark number. It's been harder to develop classifications in Latin America. I just want to turn briefly to the work that Gonzalo Navarro has been doing. He has been long active in promoting vegetation classification there, and many of you have seen his publications across the years. He published a fundamental book on Bolivian vegetation types in 2011, based on field plots collected not just there, but throughout other parts of South America. And it's those plots and his work that has made it possible to develop ecological systems, as we called them back then, which are essentially IVC groups, so a level 6, and worked with numerous colleagues in workshops led by Carmen Joss, who was then with NatureServe. And in parallel, he's been collaborating with the international team for the EcoVeg IVC approach and helped update the ordering of the 2011 Bolivian types into the revised EcoVeg hierarchy that we published in 2025. Many of those Bolivian types are shared at the Alliance or phytosociological order levels, macro group of the IVC, and so they provide a fundamental anchor for much of the work in tropical South America. And currently, the database for Bolivia is being upgraded to link to those units. And so he is proposing to fully review and upload the 2011 vegetation descriptions into the IVC database and as part of the Bolivian plot database. Another partnership in Australia, Nicholas Jelly and members of the Australian Vegetation Classification team, particularly John Hunter and Don Lewis, have been thinking through how to use EcoVeg approach in that continent. There are 7 major jurisdictions there that have been active in national in state level classifications. And so when we think about what's been done, we know again here much of the flora is endemic to the island. Alliances have been developed in the past. There are possibly 200 or 300 macro groups on the island. It's notable as a ecological context how it's centered on the deserts with this fringing set of more temperate regions around it. And there's major climate zones, which then Nico has been thinking about biogeographic structuring in order to guide macro group development. And so he's looked at the literature and drafted some proposed biogeographic provinces covering the full scope of Australian vegetation. Again, this may not apply across all biomes, but is a major starting point for the terrestrial units. So a proposal that's being put forth and considered is to use the conceptual approach of the IVC, develop coordinated teams that think through this effort across the continent, perhaps being guided by biogeographic provinces to guide initial structuring of divisions, and then moving on from there to really do the hard work of collating all the historical data and publications, and then integrating that with plot-based data where available, recognizing that there will always be a need for expert validation where plot data are weak. And there are various maps that also again help guide the geographic extent of these types. So just to quickly close here, we've talked about Europe. I just want to mention Africa has had work done on the MAC group level. It's not nearly as has led to an engagement really with African experts longer term. So it's sort of on the table. And we know we're going to need some agreement on how to describe types somewhat systematically, regardless of our traditions. The EcoVeg approach does have a database where that's supported. So just to conclude quickly, what's the benefit of doing this? Obviously, being able to report on major ecosystems across the globe at these mid-levels is important when we're thinking about climate change, changing fire dynamics, the different ways in which land use and conversion happens, the impact of invasives. We could learn a lot from each other by looking at how these major drivers are affecting ecosystems across continents. And of course, we want to do assessments. We want to understand how ecosystems are changing. And well, it's great to understand tropical rainforests broadly as a reporting unit, knowing what's happening in the Amazon, in Southeast Asia, is certainly important as well. And then setting restoration targets. We can learn a lot from each other's restoration efforts if we understand the mid-level ecosystems and their functional relations as we roll them up into biomes. There are any number of applications. Certain ecosystem mapping is a good current theme. The Global Ecosystem Atlas is using the Global Ecosystem Typology to guide rolling up maps. Again, I mentioned addressing at-risk threatened ecosystems, and the other applications are on the screen in front of you. So there are ways in which having these common units helps us to think collectively about the applications. We shouldn't let our differences in the classification frustrate our ability to communicate about the status of ecosystems. So I leave this slide very rough and crude because next steps are very speculative. Wolfgang and I are just thinking aloud with you about this. Maybe this needs to be a proposal to the IAVS Vegetation Classification Work Group. I'm sure Aaron and Chris and others are looking for work. So here's a proposal to think about. It is certainly worth talking about whether it makes sense to try to amalgamate or have types working together across approaches. It'll take forming continental teams, looking at biome concept issues, thinking about the biogeography and the functional traits, bringing plots together, forming coherent set of ecological drivers that shape the types. So it's not trivial. We put it out there. We think it's timely. We did, an early inspection of how this might look like for the IVC back in an early publication of the IVC, and we think there could be more good work to do. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don and Wolfgang, for your presentation. We've got about 12 minutes for questions, so I want to open it up. Feel free to put them in the chat and I can read them out, or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask questions.
So Don and
Yes.
Wolfgang, this is Esty. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Esty.
Hi, yeah. So once again, on that previous slide, you made all the suggestions. So how do you actually see organizationally how that's going to work? How do we communicate? Have you got a template in your mind about how we actually might go forward to suggest to the group as first steps?
Well, I can take one stab at that. I think obviously because IAVS is an international group and it's formed a vegetation classification work group, which is a relatively new initiative. Maybe it's existed in other formats in previous decades, but it seems like there is an opportunity here given a growing desire to have global classification structures to really think through together how that might happen. But it'll take some institutional consensus, if you will. It's obviously not trivial to fund this, to sustain it. It's not going to be a small team that simply puts it out there and publishes it. It needs to be a sustained effort. I think all those of us involved in classifications know that once you create something, it becomes a living thing, and you need to maintain it. So we have not thought much about how this grows. We're just putting out the idea. Wolfgang, yeah, any thoughts there?
Well, I mean, in Europe, we still have an active community of phytosociologists, at least in most countries. My own country, Austria, is not a good example for this. But on the European level, we have the working group, European Vegetation Survey. But I would say there are only a very small group of people that is currently interested in this global perspectives. So I think it will not be easy to convince people to spend time and effort for this. But I think it's worth it. But we will see.
Any other questions out there?
And Aaron, not to put you on the spot, but I don't know if the vegetation classification work group has a sense for how far to go. Is it in terms of its mission? Is it facilitating conversations like these? Is it trying to actually instigate efforts? What's your sense?
Yeah, I think that is a goal of the working group and the steering committee, and so I would encourage everyone to to reach out to us if you have ideas or questions or ways that we could facilitate these kinds of conversations, and how to merge these two approaches. We also do have we're working on a kind of in the early stages, but we have this project called Veg World where we're working on trying to consolidate a list of Braun-Blanquet types and EcoVeg types, and linking those up to determine how well do they match up, and then also trying to also validate the Braun-Blanquet types, which ones are valid, which ones are not, and so that's something that we're in the early stages of developing, but happy to facilitate, and please feel free to reach out to me or others on this steering committee, and we can take your proposals forward.
I see a comment in the chat about Latin America. I think Latin America is a very interesting, let's say, testing ground, because they use both approaches. There is some tradition using the Braun-Blanquet approach, at least in some Latin American countries, and more recently they also adopting the EcoVeg approach. And I have the feeling that at the moment they are more or less independent. I had some years ago a conversation with someone, I don't remember the name, but he developed a system of Braun-Blanquet units, and at the same time also EcoVeg system, and independently. And I said, why are you doing this? I mean, you can just combine them. It would need some revision of, for instance, the classes. They are still using very broad and heterogeneous classes that have been described many decades ago. So some of them, I guess, must be split to fit into the new formation system. But I think it would be better really to join the efforts and not develop both systems in parallel. That doesn't make any sense in my opinion. But maybe that's just me.
There was a question about what sort of number of vegetation scientists are needed to do this work in a country. And I was just writing a response, but just to answer it, I think it isn't just about numbers per se, but it's about what's the vegetation diversity in a country or on a continent, because speaking, for example, in Canada, we have Pacific coastal rainforests on the one hand, we have prairies, we have boreal forests, Arctic, and it's rare that, you know, a team of experts is knowledgeable enough to cover and work in all of those regions. And so a major challenge is to first identify experts that can cover the full range of vegetation diversity, and then to see if there's a way to collaborate, you know, on a shared approach. But that said, too, I think inevitably in any biogeographic region, having at least 2 or 3 people is important to keep each other going in the effort. Any effort like this is you know, 5 to 10 year plus effort. If you're going to mine the literature on the one hand, if you're going to access, revive, collect plot data, and then spend the time synthesizing and getting peer review done. So it takes dozens, if not hundreds, of people at the end of the day for large areas. So
looks like there's another question the chat. At which classification level is the integration of EcoVeg and Braun-Blanquet most stable, and why?
Interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know that we know enough yet because we haven't done any formal comparisons.
I mean, I see no problem at the association at the alliance level, and at the group and macro group level, there can be challenges if some traditional Braun-Blanquet classes do not fit into the upper levels of the EcoVeg system. You have to think what could be the solution. Yeah, no one has the absolute truth, so maybe one of the two has to be changed or both. But yeah,
Yeah, I think that's I think what I would say is maybe not so much a question of which level is most stable, but what's the level most worth pursuing in terms of finding stability. And I think the class level is an achievable one to look for some sort of consensus, just because it's so important to do that work globally that the sooner we can sort out the degree to which classes themselves are controlled by, say, biogeography on the one hand, and even the biome constraints, the sooner we find that out, the sooner we'll know to what degree the classes and macro groups, you know, can be thought of as comparable, you know, if not the same.
I see a question
Yeah. Go ahead.
addressing nomenclature. I mean, at the moment, Braun-Blanquet and EcoVeg have different nomenclatures, and there's no current plan to unify or merge this. But this is just about names, and names are the least important thing. I can say this because I'm a member of the nomenclature commission. But of course, I often think it would be nice if the EcoVeg units would also be described in accordance of the phytosociological code, so they're also valid in the Braun-Blanquet system and can be used in both worlds. Would be no problem, but somebody has to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe two quick points. I see we're at the top of the hour, but one is, of course, the Braun-Blanquet tradition has no way to name units above the class. So
yeah.
To name biomes is missing, so we would have to resolve that. I mean, how many different ways can we say tropical rainforest, for example? Tropical wet forest, tropical humid forest, tropical and subtropical rainforest. So there needs to be some stability at all levels. The other is maybe that there's one simple solution that Wolfgang and I talked about once, is that the Braun-Blanquet provides a scientific name and EcoVeg has a common name equivalent. And we would simply learn to come as close together on the two concepts, first of all, and then find a name that works both as a scientific Braun-Blanquet name and a common EcoVeg name. That may be ad hoc, but it might be at least a workable way to start the conversation.
Yeah, another difference between the two approaches is that the EcoVeg approach is more centralized. So you have a steering committee that maintains the classification, while Braun-Blanquet approach is very decentralized and anarchic. I mean, we have this EuroVeg checklist, and we have the European Vegetation Classification Committee that reviews proposal for changing the checklist, but it's just a checklist, and nobody is forced to follow it and can have other opinions. And in fact, in many countries, there are national lists which in one way or another deviate from the European checklist.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Don and Wolfgang, again for joining us and for the interesting presentation. And thanks to everyone out there for joining us. I hope you all have a great day or evening or whatever time it is where you're at. So thanks again, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.